Welcome back to China Economy and Society. After talking about migration, today we discuss the second pillar of the success of Chinese economic development over the last 40 years. And we'll discuss in particular China's approach to control of its population, demographic control. Let's first look at the history of the one-child policy that China has introduced in the early 80s. Already in 1970s, at the time of Mao Zedong, already people were encouraged to have one child, but no more than two. Early signs. And then in 1982, with the reforms, the new law was promulgated, and from then on, people in China could only have one child, except if they used to live in the rural areas. In the rural areas, if a family first child was a daughter, then after 4 years, they were allowed to have a second child. So we already see a difference of how this law was used in the rural areas, where people really could have more than one child. It used to be called the 1.5 policy, while in the urban areas really was more strictly applied, and family could only have one child. And then in the year 2000, a little bit of a relaxation. If both parents were single children in urban areas, then they could have a second child themselves. In 2013, a further relaxation. This time, if at least one of the two parents was a single child, then the couple could have two children. And then finally, a couple of years ago, in 2015, full relaxation of the policy. Today, in China, every family, no matter if it's in the rural area or urban areas, can have two children. What is the impact of these on some figures in China? First of all, the birth rate has decreased, of course, from the peak reached in 1987 of 2.3 to the values today, which is just less than 1.2. But more importantly, the family size. In the early 50s, in China, there were 4.5 people per family. So we are talking about almost 3 children on average. That's a very large number. Today, the number has gone down, and we have reached 3.1 number of people per family, and that means pretty much 1 child per household. So this has been the result of the policy. Now, if I look at another metric, I tend to look at the comparison of how China has decreased poverty in the country, thanks also to this policy. If we look at the graphs of people living below the poverty line from the 1950s to today, I compare it with Africa. In the 50s, about 50% of the African population was living below the poverty line. How has this changed over time? Well, it hasn't. A little bit of an improvement in the last few years, but basically, the proportion of people in Africa living below the poverty line has remained constant at 50%. On the other hand, China started with 80% of its population living under the poverty line in the 50s, and this line has been going down steadily to reach 10% today. When we look at these two lines, we can compare, on one hand, the success of the Chinese economic model that has lifted about 400 million people out of poverty. And at the same time, if you want to be a bit critical, the failure of the West in Africa. The number of people in Africa has doubled. The poverty ratio has not changed, so the number of poor people in Africa has increased pretty much by the same amount, 300, 400 million people. China is very proud of this graph. It shows that through the implementation of its policies, we discussed before migration, today we discussed demographic control, the one-child policy, has actually achieved something that no other country in the world has ever done. So this is a historic achievement. This policy has also brought some side effect, some maybe negative side effect about the future aging population in Africa. And this is what we're going to discuss in the next episode of our videocast. But for now, I want to bring your attention to the fact that In 1950s, people were hungry and there was no time to discuss what to do. China implemented a policy that had an excellent success in reducing poverty for 400 million people. Now the problem will come, but in the meantime, for these 60 years, it has been a good success. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much and goodbye.